Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are wrestling with a real giant of 20th century intellectual history. We're
Yeah,
talking about a figure who is, maybe the single most famous name associated with structuralism.
and absolutely.
And yet his entire restless career was sort of dedicated to undermining and constantly evolving beyond any fixed definition. We are talking, of course, about Roland Barthes.
It's a fascinating challenge, really. Our mission today is to unpack this central paradox.
Yeah.
How can the man credited with popularizing structural analysis also be the foundational thinker for the very movement post-structuralism that, sought to tear it all apart?
Right. That's the core of it. I mean, if you hear the word structuralism thrown around in literary theory or cultural studies, Barthes is just,
Yeah.
he's the inevitable starting point. But, for the listener who might just be prepping for a meeting or trying to get up to speed, let's start crisp. What is the standard, sort of neutral definition of structuralism that Barthes inherited?
Well, to put it simply, it's a method of analyzing cultural phenomena that's founded on the principles of Saussurian linguistics. It moves away from looking at individual surface events, a single word or one particular action in a story.
Okay.
And instead, it focuses on the underlying systems or structures that make those surface events meaningful in the first place.
So it's like studying the rules of chess rather than just watching a single move.
That's a perfect analogy. You're looking at the deep grammar of a culture, not just the random utterances. And, many of his contemporaries applied this method in a relatively neutral way.
Right. People like Jacobson, Todorov.
Exactly. Roman Jacobson, Zieten Todorov, A.J. Greimas, Gerard Genet, they were applying this new systematic methodology, often to very technical aspects of language, poetic language, narrative structure, with the goal of mapping out the universal grammar of storytelling.
So an objective cataloging.
Precisely. Their focus was often on objective cataloging. But Barthes was different.
And that's the Barthes twist, isn't it? He didn't pick up structuralism to be a neutral cartographer of meaning. He picked it up and immediately sharpened it into a weapon.
That is the crucial distinction we have to draw for this deep dive. Barthes was, at his core, a critical controversialist. For him, structuralism was less a neutral method of description and more a strategic, a weapon to deploy against what he saw as the dominant, suffocating forces of Western ideology.
And what were those dominant forces?
Science, primarily,
Yeah.
and its counterpart in the social sciences, which is positivism. Both of these rely very heavily on empiricism. So Barthes leveraged structuralism, specifically its radical understanding of language, to attack the very notion that reality is just out there, waiting to be neutrally cataloged and accepted without question.
So we're not just analyzing literary concepts today. We're actually diving into one of the core conflicts in Western intellectual history, rationalism versus empiricism.
Mhm.
And we're watching how Barthes used linguistics to sort of resurrect one side and launch a full-scale assault on the other. That's a powerful mission.
It is. We're going to track his intellectual movement from, a militant structuralist using systems to reveal hidden ideologies all the way through his critical apex in SC, and finally to his embrace of difference and plurality that leads directly into post-structuralism. We're going to show you why his distinctions like writerly versus readerly fundamentally redefine not just how we read books, but how we consume reality itself.
Okay, let's unpack this.
So to really appreciate what Barthes was doing, this kind of revolutionary act, we have to start with the ancient, ongoing battle he was fighting. We often think of Barthes' work as purely modern, but his core struggle really echoes the classic French battle between rationalism and empiricism.
The ultimate philosophical showdown. You've
Yeah.
got Descartes, who's the standard bearer for rationalism, pitted against the Anglo-Saxon tradition of, like, Locke and Hume, the empiricists.
Exactly. The French tradition, rationalism, posits that knowledge of reality is possible without relying on sense experience. Knowledge is innate a priori,
You gain truth through internal reason, like math.
like mathematics or pure logic, yes. But since the rise of modern science in the 17th and 18th centuries, which of course emphasizes observation, measurement, data, empiricism has become the major influence on Western thinking.
And empiricism says all knowledge derives solely from sense experience. We're born as blank slates and the world just writes on us. We're passive recipients of all this external data.
And that passivity, that's the political and ideological hinge point for Barthes. Empiricism treats the world as an independent, external structure that the human mind just passively tries to understand, observe, and catalog.
We're just recorders.
We're just recorders. And this, Barthes argues, fosters a profoundly conservative attitude.
How does passive observation lead to conservatism? I mean, what's the link there?
Well, if you believe that reality is a fixed objective structure that exists independently of your consciousness, and your job is merely to document it faithfully, that is, to be passive, then you are strongly, strongly discouraged from radically questioning or attempting to fundamentally change that reality.
I see the link now. It's like Marx criticizing philosophers for only interpreting the world, instead of dedicating themselves to changing it. If you accept the world as a given, an independently existing fact, then change becomes really difficult to justify philosophically.
That's the precise connection. The rationalist tradition, by contrast, encouraged critique more forcibly. If the source of truth lies in internal, rigorous, non-empirical reason, then the external world can always be held up against a standard of internal logic and coherence and, well, be judged wanting.
So, for a radical like Barthes, structuralism offered the intellectual framework to reassert that rationalist critique, to undermine that empiricist passivity. But mechanically, how does structuralism claim the mind is active?
Because structuralism's foundation, which is Saussurian linguistics, shows that meaning isn't derived from looking outside at the object, at the empirical data. Meaning is derived from the system of relations that reside internally in the mind. The key tenet is this: the mind's relation to the world is active, not passive.
So we don't just record reality.
No, the internal systems of our minds actively structure the way we perceive and understand it.
So structuralism wasn't just a new way to analyze poetry. It was a philosophical declaration that the human mind is the active agent in constructing meaning. And that provides a perfect base to attack science and positivism, which were busy claiming this passive objective neutrality.
Exactly. It gave him the philosophical high ground to claim, you think you are neutrally observing the world, but you are not. You are simply using a set of pre-existing, often invisible, cultural codes to organize your observations. Let's look at how he found that leverage in language itself.
Okay, so that active rationalist mind, it comes into sharpest focus when we look at the revolution Ferdinand de Saussure enacted in linguistics at the turn of the 20th century. Before Saussure, what did linguistics even look like?
It was purely positivist and empirical, which is another way of saying it was historical. The focus was historical or diachronic, how words and languages developed, changed, and shifted over time.
Tracing etymologies and things like that.
All right. Linguists would track sound changes and semantic evolution across centuries, treating language like a historical artifact whose meaning was derived from tracing its empirical past.
And Saussure rejected that diachronic emphasis. He basically said that's like trying to understand how a car works by tracing the history of metallurgy.
Precisely. Saussure moved the focus to the synchronic aspect, how language functions as a complete system of signs at a particular point in time. If you want to understand how language works now, looking at its 16th century roots only obscures the current system of relations. This led to his most critical distinction, the conceptual foundation for all of structuralism: Lang versus parole.
Let's break that down, because these terms are often academicized, but they're absolutely crucial for Barthes' political argument. So what is Lang?
Lang, which literally means language, is the abstract underlying system that governs language use. It's the collective mental store of rules, grammar, and potential vocabulary shared by a community. It is the fixed, invisible structure. It only exists as a mental construct.
Okay, and parole?
Parole, literally speech, is the opposite. It's the actual, concrete, observable instance of language use. It's the empirically existing data, the specific sounds, the words I'm using in this sentence, the sentences you spoke just now. It is individual and momentary.
And Saussure's overriding interest was always in the abstract, invisible Lang, the system. So why is that a return to rationalism, philosophically speaking?
Because Lang is not empirically present. It's not an object you can point to and investigate.
Yeah.
You can't put a grammar system in a petri dish. It has to be reconstructed, reasoned out, inferred from the observable parole. So to study Lang is to prioritize the system, the internal logic, over the random, messy data of external experience. It's Cartesian in nature, knowledge derived from internal mental structure.
So when a linguist or a structuralist analyzes a text, they aren't treating it as mere observable data as parole.
No.
They're treating it as a window into the deep rules that make that text possible, the Lang.
Exactly. And this rationalist lineage is so powerful that decades later, Noam Chomsky, while he was technically moving beyond Saussure in some respects, he centered his own linguistic theory on the innate internal capacity that allows users to generate novel sentences. He called the system competence, and the actual utterance performance. And what did Chomsky title his historical investigation into this idea?
Cartesian linguistics.
Cartesian linguistics. The connection to the French rationalist tradition is completely explicit.
The implication for Barthes and his critique of reality is just immense then. If language is an arbitrary system of signs that mediates between the human mind and external reality, and Barthes really emphasizes that meaning is arbitrary and relational.
Then language actively structures the world. Meaning isn't inherent in the tree. Meaning is produced by the difference between the word tree and the word bush within the system of English. Right. If language refracts our relationship with reality, then any scientific claim to simply look through language and describe reality neutrally is instantly invalidated. Language is the active filter, and if that filter is arbitrary, then reality, as we experience it, is fundamentally structured by a socially constructed system, not by objective facts.
So the arbitrary nature of the sign is the smoking gun. It proves that the mind is active, and therefore the positivist claim that we are just passively observing facts is, well, a lie.
It's the linchpin. Because meaning is relational, produced by differences within the system, the lang, not by a word having a one-to-one correspondence with an external object, structuralism provides Barthes with the tool to expose any system, whether it's fashion, food, or narrative, as a network of socially agreed-upon distinctions, not natural truths. That network is what Barthes set out to destroy.
Okay, so once Barthes grasped that language is this arbitrary active system, he aimed his structuralist weapons squarely at the scientific establishment. How did he articulate their fundamental misunderstanding of language?
In his essay, From Science to Literature, he argued that science, the bastion of empiricism and objectivity, views language as a transparent and neutral instrument. For science, language is subjugated to the real matters, the operations, the hypotheses, the results.
The fact.
The facts. These facts supposedly exist outside of language preceding it. Language is merely the delivery mechanism.
The analogy is perfect. Science treats language like a clear window pane. It just wants to look through it to the objective reality beyond.
Exactly. Barthes then contrasts this with literature. Literature, he asserts, is made up only of language. Language is the being of literature, its very world. Literature refuses to be a transparent window pane. It insists you look at the glass at its structure, its opacity, its colors.
And this is where literature gets its ethical and political power. It's no longer about documenting reality, it's about questioning it.
Absolutely. Because literature works solely within the active structuring system of language, it allows us to question reality and not merely accept it passively. And Barthes makes a radical ethical claim here. He says, ethically, it is solely by its passage through language that literature pursues the disturbance of the essential concepts of our culture, reality chief among them.
Wow. So if you want to disrupt the status quo, you must first disrupt the language that describes the status quo.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
And this systematic effort to analyze and classify forms of speech, which is what structuralism does, Barthes argued, has an ancient predecessor that was ideologically dismissed.
Rhetoric.
He called rhetoric structuralism's glamorous ancestor. Rhetoric was the study of how language works formally and persuasively. It was discredited in the modern era because the positivist scientific view claimed that objective reality should speak for itself, without needing a stylistic flourish or formal analysis.
And Barthes saw structuralism as resurrecting that systematic analysis of form, but with a critical political edge.
Yes, but then, in a very Barthesian move, he starts to criticize structuralism itself. He argued that it, too, became infected by the scientific aspiration toward objectivity.
He saw the trap.
He saw the trap. If structuralism merely describes and analyzes the structures of texts neutrally, as some of his contemporaries were doing, it risks becoming a new kind of positivism, a science of signs. So Barthes argued that the logical extension of structuralism must be to abandon the pretense of objective analysis and instead join literature, becoming an activity of writing.
Which means the critic or analyst has to recognize their own subjective role in the act of analysis and the inherent political nature of the own language.
Yes. And this split, this bifurcation, leads directly to his crucial social and ideological distinction, the one that really defines his critical project. The difference between écrivance and écriture.
Okay, let's nail these down because they carry enormous weight. What is écrivance?
Écrivance, which we can translate as readerly writing, is the language that seeks transparency. It's the type of writing that pretends to be neutral, clear, and unmediated. And crucially, it is complicit with the prevailing dominant ideology and its positivist scientific basis.
So, like standard journalism, academic papers that deny their own ideological framing, or formulaic realist fiction.
All of that. This writing reinforces a conservative ideology. It accepts the world as a given, legible fact. It assumes the reader is passive, just ready to absorb the facts delivered by the text. In Barthes' view, this is ideological poison.
And then there is écriture, the radical alternative, the writerly writing.
Écriture is literary writing that actively contests that positivist view of language as neutral. This writing recognizes itself as a total code, one that is aware of its own forces of destruction. It's dense, it's self-reflexive, and it's politically charged because its form undermines convention. Barthes says, and this is a profound statement, that only writing alone can break the theological image imposed by science.
When he says theological image, he's implying that the scientific claim to neutral truth is just another kind of received dogma that demands faith, not scrutiny.
Precisely. And this is why Barthes consistently displays such hostility toward the realist novel, especially the formulaic kind that simply reinforces known social and psychological codes. It's based on écrivance, it doesn't disrupt reality, it naturalizes it. For Barthes, the modernist movement, particularly the Nouveau Roman,
The anti-plot, anti-character novels of the French mid-century.
those perfectly embodied écriture. The refusal of traditional plot and character arcs was itself a political statement. It was a formal resistance.
The Nouveau Roman refuses to give you the familiar, consumable structure. It makes you work.
It makes you work.
Yeah.
But, Barthes did acknowledge there was an obvious distinction even within realism between the formulaic airport novel and highly complex literary realists like Balzac or Stendhal. This necessity to differentiate between complex types of realism, those that merely replicate codes versus those that subtly destabilize them, is what forced him to undertake his deep textual dive into Balzac's Sarracine in SZ.
So SZ, published in 1970, this is the text that shows Barthes transitioning from structuralism to post-structuralism in real time. He's using a structuralist framework, like dividing the text and analyzing codes, but his goal is post-structuralist, to celebrate plurality and difference.
He's using the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, so to speak. And this is where the terminology shifts from the political contrivance to the more textual, scriptable, writerly, and lisable, readerly. And right off the bat, he starts to burn the bridges to his structuralist past.
Oh.
Well, in the introduction to SZ, he explicitly distances himself from the earlier grand ambition of structuralist narratology, the ambition to establish a universal grammar of narrative. Think of Vladimir Prop's 31 Functions of the Folktale, or A.J. Grimes's actantial model for character roles.
Right. Those structuralists were trying to create the ultimate exhaustive blueprint for all possible stories, the model.
Yes, the search for the universal model. And Barthes describes this attempt to see all the world's stories within a single structure as a task as exhausting as it is ultimately undesirable.
Undesirable? Why undesirable?
Because, he says, the text thereby loses its difference.
And that is the core shift, isn't it? The structuralist prized the unity of the model. The post-structuralist prizes the unique difference of the singular text.
The focus shifts entirely. The single text is no longer seen as an inductive access to a model that can be applied everywhere. Instead, it's an entrance into a network with 1,000 entrances. He moves from the architecture of narrative production, the overarching structure, to the internal play of meaning production within the text itself.
But he still maintains his hostility to the lisable, the readerly text. The vast majority of what we read, he says, is readerly. What's the fundamental difference in the reader's role?
The readerly text is a product. It's merchandise to be consumed passively. It makes up the enormous mass of our literature. But the value of the scriptable, the writerly text, is its demand that the reader transition from consumer to producer.
Right.
The writerly text is not a final object. It's a galaxy of signifiers, a perpetual present.
So it's literature that doesn't claim to represent an objective reality, but actively forces the reader to construct meaning alongside it. That sounds profoundly challenging.
It is challenging by design. And the celebration of infinite play and the galaxy of signifiers carries, very clear echoes of Jacques Derrida's ideas about free play that were circulating following that 1966 Johns Hopkins conference Barthes attended. He's consciously participating in the theoretical dismantling of traditional concepts of authorship and fixed meaning.
So Barthes needed the complexity of a Balzac novel to prove his point. A realist text is complex, but ultimately, how does Barthes claim it still tries to contain that infinite play and limit the plurality of entrances?
The limited plurality of a realist text is managed through the system of connotation. While a truly writerly text explodes into infinite meaning, even a complex readerly text like Sarracine possesses multiple layered meanings, the connotations, that allow for analysis, but which eventually try to converge on a central unifying point.
Okay, and this leads us to his most radical claim, the one that truly weaponized this distinction, his critique of denotation itself. If connotation is secondary, how does he argue denotation is just another form of ideology?
This is a devastating insight. Conventionally, denotation is the literal, dictionary meaning the objective ground zero. Connotation is just the added color. Barthes demolishes this hierarchy. He argues that denotation has no intrinsic priority over connotation.
What?
Denotation is not the first meaning, he says, but only pretends to be the first. In fact, denotation is merely the last of the connotations.
The one that is socially agreed upon and ideologically enforced to close the reading.
Exactly. It's the connotative meaning that is granted the greatest power for ideological reasons to prevent the text from fracturing into infinite play. For example, the image Barthes famously analyzed in mythologies, the photograph of a black soldier saluting the French flag. The denotation is a soldier saluting the flag.
Simple fact.
But the connotation, the last of the connotations that tries to pass as literal, is France is a great empire, beyond racial division, and all its sons serve proudly.
That distinction shows us that the literal meaning is not a linguistic product, but an ideological one. That's the key to understanding Barthes' project.
By showing that the text is a plurality of connotations, he displaces the idea of a singular literal meaning, moving structurally toward deconstruction. And by doing so, he dismantles not just the text, but the very notion of the unified, centered reader.
That displacement of denotation is so critical, because it forces us to recognize that our subjectivity, the I that reads a text, is itself just a collection of pre-existing texts and codes.
Barthes suggests that the subjective I is merely the wake of all the codes which constitute me. You aren't a neutral interpreter. You are the sum total of the cultural assumptions you bring to the page.
Which is a really challenging thought for the empiricist worldview, which loves the idea of the sovereign, objective observer. If my subjectivity is simply the echo of the codes I've absorbed, then even my most personal interpretation is socially structured.
And that's what makes the 5 codes he introduces in SZ so crucial. He momentarily returns to a structuralist-like framework, but he uses it playfully, not scientifically, to expose how the lisable, the readerly text, actually operates to organize our understanding and create the reality effect.
Okay, let's walk through these 5 codes, because they are often just listed in academic summaries, but they are the working mechanism of a complex text. Let's imagine a short passage from a classic realist novel, maybe the opening of a scene. The old clock struck 6, and Monsieur Valmont, weary from the day's work and plagued by a persistent cough, slowly opened the letter left on the mahogany desk.
That's a perfect example. We can see all 5 codes operating right there. First, the proeretic code. This controls the reader's construction of the plot, the sequence of actions. In our passage, the proeretic code tracks the sequence. Clock strikes. Valmont opens the letter.
That code manages the logic of events. A leads to B. We understand that opening the letter is an action that advances the plot.
Exactly. Second, you have the hermeneutic code. This presents the reader with a question or an enigma, giving the plot momentum. Why is Valmont coughing? What does the letter contain? Why was it left on the desk?
The hermeneutic code creates suspense, asking questions and postponing the answer. It's the engine of narrative engagement, really.
It is. Third, the Semit code. This is concerned with characteristics and psychological traits. The text refers to Valmont as weary and plagued by a persistent cough. These seams, or bundles of connotation, build the reader's understanding of his character. Perhaps he's melancholy, perhaps ill, perhaps overworked. These characteristics are not neutral facts. They are constructed meanings.
Okay, fourth is the symbolic code.
Right. This deals with the organization of broader symbolic meanings. In our example, the old clock striking 6 and the mahogany desk could symbolize the passage of time, routine, and a certain bourgeois stability or wealth. These symbols don't just describe the room. They attach thematic weight to the environment.
And finally, the referential code.
The referential code consists of references to cultural phenomena the reader is expected to understand from outside the text itself. When the text mentions a mahogany desk, it relies on our shared cultural knowledge of what a mahogany desk signifies in 19th century French society stability, office work, a certain economic class. It's what allows the text to pass itself off as realistic.
And this analysis, where Barthes breaks the text down into lexias, these small units of meaning, to show how they activate these codes, it demonstrates precisely how the reality effect is produced. It's a mechanism, not some kind of miracle.
It's a mechanical generation of meaning. Like the barcode you mentioned earlier, The codes work together to create the illusion of depth and objective reality. This is why the philosophical comparison to Kant's categories of mind is so illuminating, but it's also ultimately where Barthes makes his revolutionary break.
Right, because Kant argued that categories like causality, unity, substance were innate structures of the human mind that ordered our raw sensory experience into an understandable world.
Barthes is doing something similar, showing how the codes order the raw text into an intelligible story. But where Kant believed his categories were intrinsic and unavoidable, Barthes insists that his five codes are socially constructed.
Ah, that's the punchline. If the codes are social constructs, then we are not philosophically condemned to accept them. They can be changed, resisted, or even destroyed.
That is the revolutionary heart of his theory. The writerly text, by refusing to operate within the limits of these established, socially agreed-upon codes, has the potential to allow the reader to escape a reality that is determined in advance by ideology and potentially create a new one. The critique isn't just about reading books, it's about changing society by changing how we process input.
Okay, so this highly political, revolutionary potential of Bertha's work was immediately recognized by British critics, particularly in the 1970s and 80s, who were very keen to link literary form directly to socioeconomic structures.
Oh, it was hugely influential. Barthes provided a sophisticated analytical framework, the lisable versus scriptable distinction, to mount a full-scale assault on the ideology of the classic realist novel.
Let's start with Stephen Heath. He argued that the realist novel is readable because it merely repeats the already known, operating via conventions that achieve a naturalized transparence.
Heath argued that the realist novel, like those by someone like George Eliot, attempts to give a faithful account of men and things as they have mirrored themselves in my mind. The transparency is the problem. It suggests the author is merely a neutral mirror, reflecting reality, when in fact they are simply reflecting the prevailing cultural codes.
Whereas Barthes favored the Nouveau Roman, which rejected transparency entirely.
Exactly. It showed that language itself is opaque.
And this connects directly to Colin McCabe, who coined that defining phrase for this critical school, the classic realist text. What was the core mechanism McCabe identified in these texts?
McCabe argued that the classic realist text establishes a hierarchy of discourses, where the narration, often signaled by inverted commas for dialogue, functions as a metalanguage. This metalanguage acts as the supreme, unchallengeable voice, and crucially, this voice refuses to acknowledge its own status as writing.
So the narrator acts as the voice of objective truth, the neutral observer acting simply as a window on reality.
Precisely. And by acting as the window, the narration suppresses any competing discourses within the text, the character dialogue, the subjective thoughts, by placing them beneath its objective authority. McCabe claimed that only modernist writing, like James Joyce's stream of consciousness, disrupts this metalanguage and forces the writing to acknowledge its own constructed status.
Other British critics, particularly those coming from a political materialism perspective, took this straight into the realm of economics and capitalism. Rosalind Coward and John Ellis, for instance.
They made a direct, highly provocative link. They argued that realism stresses the product and not the production. And this mirrors the repression of production in capitalist society, where the market delivers a finished product, a commodity that completely masks the labor, the ideological choices, and the material realities that went into making it.
And Catherine Belsey formalized this. She defined classic realism, lisable, as the dominant form of the 19th century, the era of industrial capitalism, and explicitly called the readable text merchandise to be consumed.
Yes. The reader is trained to be a passive consumer of narratives, just as the citizen is trained to be a passive consumer in the marketplace. It's a powerful, unified critique, but we should acknowledge Barthes' own nuance here. Barthes himself seemed more aware of the internal paradox. The fact that these critics were attacking the passive, readerly text using critical discourse that was itself often simple and, well, readerly.
They were using the clear window pane of academic writing to critique the window pane of realism.
Yes, for Barthes, true political engagement lay at the level of form. Writerly language is inherently political by undermining conventions of transparency at the deepest formal level. Simply criticizing ideology transparently might perpetuate the very transparency you were fighting against.
That brings us to the other side of the Atlantic, where Barthes' ideas were met with far more intellectual friction, specifically from American deconstruction. When Barthes presented his paper at Johns Hopkins in 1966, he got a very skeptical response from Paul DeMann.
DeMond was scathing. He attacked Barthes for promoting an optimistic historical myth. De Man believed Barthes was distorting literary history by claiming that progressive critical thought was only possible after a certain date after Mallarmé in modernism, culminating in the Nouveau Roman.
Dumas argued that Barthes needed this myth of historical progress to justify his new critical method.
Exactly. De Man pointed out that the complex, fragmented ego, the very thing Barthes claimed only modernism successfully treated, was explicitly treated in 17th century stories and romantic autobiography. De Man essentially accused Barthes of being unconcerned with the empirical facts of literary history because he needed this narrative of progress to justify his own radical approach.
So how did Barthes, the great demythologizer, respond to the charge that he was building his own myth?
In classic Barthesian style, he embraced it. He stated that he never succeeds in defining literary history independently of what time is added to it. He always gives it a mythical dimension. He viewed the historical past as a sort of gluey matter from which he had to detach himself by living his present as a combat.
That is the ultimate anti-empiricist statement. He's saying, I don't care about your empirical facts of history because history is never delivered to us neutrally anyway. It's always delivered as a thick ideological narrative.
A myth.
He prioritized change and critical intervention. If challenging the status quo requires using a historical myth of progress, then so be it. And this fundamentally separates Barthes, the activist and creator of possibilities, from De Man, the extreme skeptic who prioritized the rigorous dismantling of all claims to truth, even if it led to political paralysis.
Okay, so de Man's main theoretical objection wasn't just about literary history. It was that Barthes still relied too heavily on these fundamental oppositions. Writerly versus readerly, écriture versus écrivain.
Exactly.
In Demanian deconstruction, any reliance on a clear binary opposition makes you vulnerable to being deconstructed yourself.
And this critique was vividly realized by Barbara Johnson, one of de Man's students at Yale, who turned the tools of deconstruction onto Barthes' centerpiece as Z.
What was her goal? She aimed to show that Barthes' attempt to categorize Balzac's Sarrasine as a limited, merely readerly text was a fundamental critical failure that collapsed under the weight of the text's own complexity.
And the plot twist of Sarrasine is the key to her argument.
It is. The novella focuses on a sculptor, Sarrasine, who falls desperately in love with the opera singer La Zambinella, utterly ignorant that La Zambinella is a castrato, a man who has been castrated. The love object is sexually undecidable.
So the central narrative tension is built entirely around the collapse of the foundational opposition between male and female.
Precisely. Barthes has built his system on the difference between the categories. Readerly is different from writerly. But Johnson argues that the plot twist shows the difference between male-female collapses into a difference within. The castrato contains both, and neither.
So the text itself, the supposed exemplar of the readerly tradition, is already aware that its fundamental oppositions are unsustainable.
Johnson's conclusion is radical. She says Balzac's text had already deconstructed the most basic of oppositions. She suggests that the very act of reading the readerly text reveals it to be nothing other than a deconstruction of the readerly text. It outflanks Barthes by saying the text is already performing the critical work Barthes attributes only to the writerly text.
Demanian deconstruction then tries to seize the anti-positivist high ground by showing that Barthes' necessary use of oppositions makes him complicit with the kind of rigid thinking he was fighting.
It's a valid logical point, but it misses Barthes' political intentionality. De Man's skepticism led him to conclude that, reading is impossible, or at best, an act that endlessly defers meaning. Barthes, however, wanted reading to make a difference. His use of the writerly-readerly opposition was activist. Even if those oppositions were logically vulnerable to deconstructive logic, they were necessary tools for ideological critique and change.
And we shouldn't forget Barthes' playfulness, the very thing that makes his structural analysis so different from, say, Gramsci's semiotics.
That is the ultimate nuance. Barthes' presentation of the 5 codes in SZ was rigorous, but it was not a scientific claim. He wouldn't have been surprised that the writerly-readerly distinction was not absolute. He recognized the slipperiness of language. His genius lay in using the structuralist tools to reveal the underlying mechanisms of power and ideology, even if those tools were imperfect.
So Roland Barthes truly was a critic who never stood still. He is so difficult to categorize, but his initial militant adoption of structuralism as a critical weapon is what gave him the traction to dismantle the notion of neutral language and passive reading.
He cannot be securely pinned down to one school, though structuralist has strong force. His work interacted dynamically with modernism, with the politics of reading and writing, his refusal to accept the division between artist and critic, and his awareness of the post-structuralist moment. He remains a towering, influential figure because he taught us that the choice of language, whether transparent or opaque, is always an ethical and political act.
What a monumental intellectual journey. So, to quickly review our deep dive, we saw Barthes transform structuralism from a neutral method into a necessary weapon, using rationalist critique to attack the passivity of empiricism and positivist science.
And that critique was rooted in the Saussurean realization that language is an active, arbitrary system. This led to the political necessity of the readily texturture, which demands the reader become an active producer of meaning, not a passive consumer of ideological products.
And his lasting, most challenging nugget of knowledge is the claim that denotation literal truth is simply the last, most politically powerful ideological connotation, a mechanism used to shut down the inherent plurality of meaning and enforce a conservative reading of the world.
He demonstrated that the very codes we use to interpret reality are social constructs, not Kantian absolutes, and that gives us freedom. Barthes suggests that by embracing the writerly approach, we can escape a reality determined in advance by ideology-rooted codes and potentially create a new reality.
And that brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the learner. Barthes proved that our perception of reality is structured by the socially constructed codes we use to read texts, whether that's a novel, a news article, or social media. If we want to fundamentally challenge the dominant, often invisible ideologies of our current world, what new codes might we need to consciously employ today? How do we become producers, not just consumers, of our own 21st century reality?
Something to ponder deeply.
We'll catch you next time for the next deep dive.